So, Mr. Daniel Steinman, and for those who just tuned in right now, this is Econojet. Let's Talk Business with Mr. Daniel Steinman. We are talking budget, and that is, of course, the national budget that we are talking about, and also the importance of it surrounding the GDP, that is gross domestic product.
Okay. Elsie, when we talk budget, there are two big components. The one is revenue. That's the income of the government.
Yeah.
So that is what you call, or that is the resources available to the fiscus. And fiscus is Latin, but it's also English.
Yes.
And it simply means, in the old medieval times, the guy that walked just behind the king, he was always carrying a black bag, and he was collecting taxes from the people next to the street as they went along. And his taxes was in gold coins.
Yeah.
And they would chuck this in his black bag, and when the king gets back to wherever he went, then they would count this, and they would say, this is what goes to the fiscus, because that is the name of that guy with the black bag. That's where the word, the fiscal year, the fiscal income, anything that's got to do with government revenue is referred to as part of the fiscus or fiscal, blah, blah, blah. So it makes sense, huh?
Yeah.
So the one component is revenue, the fiscal side. The second one is expenditure. If your revenue is bigger than your expenditure, it means there's a surplus, and you're very lucky. If your expenditure is more than your revenue, you're not so lucky. But it's not a train smash. It's not the end of the world. In fact, except for Botswana, out of the 227 countries in the world, I do not know of any other country that budget on a surplus. And what's so interesting, even Botswana with the diamond revenue, diamond billions, they had to budget for a deficit in 2020 with COVID. Yeah, so high and mighty heroes can also fall.
Yes.
But I'm joking now. The third component of a budget is the smallest of the three, but the one with the biggest impact, and that is the deficit. So you've got the income side, revenue, fiscal. You've got the expenditure side, what the budget is going to lay out in terms of money. You've got the difference, that is either a surplus, which we never had, or a deficit, which in some years was really shocking. 1996, I remember, was a crisis year. 2009 was a crisis year. 2017 was a crisis year. These were years where the deficit started approaching 10% of revenue. Now, at this point, I must immediately draw our listeners' attention to the fact that when you talk government economics, there are certain comparisons that you make relative to GDP. For instance, if you take national debt is always expressed as a percentage of GDP. Why? Because the size of the economy as a whole is a very good indication of the ability of the government to service the national debt. You got that?
Yep.
National debt expressed as or in its relationship to GDP. When you talk deficit, you don't express it as a percentage of GDP because it's irrelevant what the GDP is. The deficit is important as a percentage of revenue. Because that shows you what is your shortfall on your revenue. And it's always a percentage. If it's very bad, like 2-3 years ago with COVID, it comes close to 10% of revenue. So you must remember, at the end of the day, the deficit spending is added to the expenditure. So it makes the gap between expenditure and revenue, between income and outlay, it makes it even bigger. Are you with me?
Yeah.
It makes sense that the budget deficit is expressed as a percentage of revenue, because you need to get an understanding or a picture in your mind what is the shortfall. I'm repeating myself now because I'm trying to find words that can easily be understood to understand that critical difference in the comparisons that you make. Maybe I should get less technical and carry on to deficit. I think what's more important, expressed as a percentage of revenue. I think we will, for the first time in a very long time, in more than 10 years, come close to about 4% of revenue.
Okay.
It means that the budget deficit has been contained. At one point in 2020, it was a runaway situation, but it was not uniquely Namibian. It was a runaway situation for many governments across the world because of the additional expenses around the pandemic.
Yes.
And the rate, the tempo at which countries manage to overcome that impact, that differs for various countries. There are many countries in Africa that will still suffer from COVID spending 10 years from now. We are basically at the point where we've neutralized the effects. We are at a late 2019, early 2020 point, meaning we've lost 3 years, but the footing, the foundation is such that we can carry on building on that. Where there are, let me give you a practical example. The problems in Argentina now is the same, and I often say this, as the same as in Mexico and in Turkey and South Korea and wherever. They are COVID related, and they are still very serious, very severe. With us, we've basically managed to overcome that now. And the fact that the deficit, that I expect a deficit in the region of about 4% of revenue, is a clear indication that we have, over a 4-year period, we have managed to bring that deficit down every year. So the shortfall is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Not in nominal terms. We need more money every year,
of course,
but as a ratio, as a percentage of what we get in, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and that will be the crucial test for the budget. Will be the deficit.
Okay.
Because we've been working so hard to manage it, to control it, to grab hold of it, to avoid it running away. Why? Because we sit with this debt thing that everybody always carries on about, national debt. If you have deficit upon deficit upon deficit for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, the result is that your debt grows and grows and grows and grows until the point where you basically can't afford it. But you remember how I closed last week's conversation? Our debt is nothing.
It's nothing. It's nothing. We can handle that.
We can certainly handle it.
And let's end it on that note. Thank you so much for tuning in on your power station Energy 100. This was your hostess Elsa Binyanya on Econo Chat. Let's talk business with Mr. Daniel Steinman. Until we meet again next week.